Okay, good morning. Today's daf is daf Kuf Tesvav 115. We're going to pick up at, even though we did it yesterday, but to pick up the thought again, we'll pick up on Kuf Yedalad Amud Beis, 4 lines up from the bottom. Amar Rabbi Yochanan. Rabbi Yochanan says, Mashkino umeis. So what happened? You had someone who, let's say I had someone who owed me money, and I went and I took a mashko, and I took some kind of security, and I did it the right way through Bezdin or whatever. It's not talking about where he went and grabbed it himself necessarily. But mace, and then the borrower who had provided the security, he died. But at this particular moment when he died, it was back in the hands of the borrower, because as we've been talking about for the last number of days, you have the obligation to return it to him if it's something that he needs. So that's what happened. He borrowed money from me. I took a mashkon. I then gave him back the mashkon to be able to use it during the day or night, depending on the mashkon, and then he died while he's holding it. So Rabbi Yochanan's halacha is shamto me'al gabe banav, that you can take it away from his sons. So what would be the question here? The obvious issue is that we know that when someone dies and his heirs, his yisomim, take over the estate, that someone who's owed money from an estate can collect if it's secured by real estate, but not if it's secured by metaltalin. So in this case, this was a loan that was not secured by real estate, and he wants to go collect from this thing. So we say that he can go ahead, according to Rabbi Yochanan, and he can still take back his item. And we'll explore this a little bit shortly. So the Gemara says, Meisvei ask a question on Rabbi Yochanan's halacha, that the Brisa says, Rabbi Meir says, once we have taken an item from someone as security to secure his loan, why would we return it? So now the Gemara interjects here and says, what do you mean? Why would you return it? Lama machzirin. Rachmana amar hader. Because that's what the Torah tells us to do. The Torah tells us that if you take a mashkon from someone, and it's an item that he requires for his livelihood or to go to sleep or whatever it is, that you have to return it. So that's why we return it. So what kind of question is that? Once you've taken it, why do you return it? You return it because the Torah makes you return it. So we say, Ella, rather you should read the Brisa as follows. Me'acher shemachzirin lama chozen umashkinin. That once you have returned it to him once, why would you go back and keep taking it from him every day? And the question is basically, as we started to say yesterday, is a very basic one, is what are you accomplishing with this whole thing? Because you're going and you're taking an item from him, but then every time he needs it, you're giving it back to him. So how are you really helping yourself? So the Gemara says, Shalo tehei shvias mishamteto v'lo yasem metaltal neitzel banav. He says the reason you take the mashkon from him and you keep taking it, we'll see about the keep taking it, but the reason you take the mashkon from him is really 2 reasons. One is because if you have collected a mashkon from him, even though you're giving it back to him every day, that at the end of Shemitah, when we know when debts are expunged, that this debt would not be expunged because he has taken a mashkon, and we'll explain that in a minute, I think. And the second point is, well, Yasim Metaltal and Eitzel Banav. That's the other reason, because for the very point that Rabbi Yochanan was talking about, which is that if he has taken it as a mashkon, it no longer is treated as Metaltal and Eitzel Banav, and rather it's treated as a secured object, and therefore even if the borrower, during a period of time that you've given him back his mashkon, even if he were to die, you would be able to take it from the Yarshim. So that's what the Brisa says. Now, the Gemara, so let's just pay attention to what the Brisa said. The Brisa says, once you've taken it from him, why do you return, and then you've returned it to him, why do you take it again? So the Gemara wants to make a diak from that. He says, Taima the hadar umashkene. What's the reason? And then we said the reason you do that is because you're protected from shvius, and you're protected that you're able to take it from the heirs. So the Gemara is being medayik and says, so therefore, when can you take it from the heirs? It must be Taima the hadar umashkene. It's only if you go and you keep taking it back. And the way the Gemara understands this at the moment is the idea that the Gemara's advice, or the Brise's advice, is always take it back as much as you can, because that way, if the guy happens to die, when you're holding it, you'll be in possession of it. So, but the Gemara says, time of the hadar mashkin. It sounds like we're talking about the fact that you should keep going and taking it again. Lo hadar mashkin. But if you wouldn't go ahead and take it, lo, then it wouldn't work. So what would that imply? That would imply he's saying that if you happen to be holding it at the time that he dies because you keep taking it back, you'll be better off. But if you're not holding it, meaning he happened to die in a period of time when he was actually back in possession of his item, you would not be able to take it from the heirs. So that, the implication of that brisa, that the protection of being able to collect it from the heirs is simply during the period of time when you're actually in possession, and that's why you should keep taking it. So that would be a kasha on Rabbi Yochanan, because Rabbi Yochanan said, anytime you take the mashkon and then subsequently the guy dies, you can strip it away from the yarshim. So Rav Bar Masna says, V'lav terutza kometaretz asla taretz hachi. He says, haven't you already modified this brisa? You should modify it differently than you did. What's the reference to that? Because we started where we quoted the brisa and said, once you've taken the item as security, why should you give it back? And the Gemara interjected and said, well, what do you mean? You give it back because the Torah told you to give it back. So he said, no, what we meant was, why do you go back and be mamashkin it? So therefore, Rav Bar Masna says, once you're recasting the brisa, recast the brisa in a different way and say as follows, he says, no, understand the brisa should be saying something else. Since you're going to have to give it back to him every time he needs it, because the Torah tells you to, then lama mimashkin, and then why take it? Lama mimashkin meikar. Why take it in the first place? In other words, you're wasting your time. So you're going to go get a security, and then every time he needs it, you give it back to him. So what did you accomplish? And so the Gemara says the reason you ever take a mashkin, you ever take security is shlote shvius misham tato, so that Shemitah should not cancel the debt, and that it shouldn't become treated like metaltalin by his children, and you would not be able to collect the debt, but rather, in this case, you can. What is the reason, just to speak it out, why in these two cases you can collect the debt once you have taken a mashkin once? Would be because, in the case of Shvius, in the case of Shemitah, because the prohibition, or the concept of Shemitah, the way it's cast, is that once Shemitah comes, lo yigos, you can't push him, you can't pressure him to pay you the debt. But if I'm in possession of an item, right, so then I don't need it. And let's say I was holding his item and he died. I could go sell it, I could liquidate it, I don't have to pressure him. So therefore, once I take it as a mashkon once, I now have a stake in it, and I can take it on my own. It belongs to me in some sense, and I don't need to pressure him. So therefore, it's not canceled by Shvius. And in the case of metaltal and eitzel banav, it's a similar concept, which is the idea that once I take it as a mashkon, when I give it back to them, I'm treating it. Rashi says it's treating it like a pikadon. He said the mashkene kanye, that once I give it back, once I take it as a mashkon, I acquire the item, and when I give it back to the guy because he needs it for the day, have a pikadon gabe. It's a pikadon by him. So therefore, just like if I have an item and I say, "Can you watch my watch?" and then Shemitah comes, I still get my watch back. It's not a loan. I deposit it with you. And similarly, if I give a guy my watch and say, "Can you watch it for me?" and then he dies, I can take it back from the heirs because it's not a debt. So basically, that's what the Gemara is saying, is the way we're going to understand the Brisa. The Brisa is saying that the purpose of taking a mashkon, even though you're going to have to constantly give it back to him, is because it shifts it to a point where once I take the mashkon, I become an owner of sorts, and once I'm that owner, then Shemitah doesn't cancel it, and I could take it away from the heirs. Tosa says, if you take a look at the first Tosa, so he says, okay, so if that's true, once you take a mashkon the first time, then you now are a part owner, and it becomes like a pikadon, and you could always take it back. So then the question is, so what I should do is, I should take the pikadon once, and then I should give it back to him when he needs it, and then I stop, because now at this point I own it. I've taken the advantages that we just described. And Tosa says, you could say as follows, first of all, what's the reason to keep taking it? One is because you don't want it to ever be where he denies the debt. So if every day you've been picking up the mashkon, it's very hard for him to say, I didn't owe him the money. So therefore, that's one reason. He says, V'gam yimayir l'fro chovo, u'levakish mos, that the other thing is, if every day you come and you take his plow every night, or you come take his pajamas every morning, then he is going to hurry himself to pay off the chov, and he's going to go seek money, because he's embarrassed that every day you come and you're picking up his pajamas in the morning, then after a little while he's going to get fed up and he'll go figure out how to get the money. So therefore, the halachic accomplishment of taking a mashkon is accomplished by taking it once. Tosfos is saying the reason you would keep taking it every day is a much more practical issue, so that he can't deny it, or that he will be embarrassed enough that he'll push himself to go find the money. Okay, so we're at the Gemara about 8 lines down. The first words on the line, Tanu Rabbanan. So we say as follows: the pasuk says, "Lo savo el beiso lavot avuto." It says you should not, when someone owes you money and you're taking a mashkon, you're taking a security to at the time that the debt is due. Lo savo el beiso lavot avuto. You should not come to his house to take the security. So the Brisa darshans lebeso iata nechnas, that you should not come into his house. So beso is a reference specifically to him. Aval ata nechnas lebeso shel arev. But you can, in fact, go into the house that belongs to the guarantor. So if I lent the guy money, and he doesn't pay me, I cannot go into his house and take his pillow. But if someone guaranteed the loan, and I want to go take the pillow from the guarantor, then I can just walk into his house and take the pillow. Because we darshan from the pasuk, Beiso is specific to the borrower. V'chein hu amar, so it says, the pasuk, Lokach bigdo, there's a pasuk, the pasuk in Mishlei, Lokach bigdo, take his beged, his garment, ki arev zar, because you chose to guarantee the debt of a stranger, meaning that someone who guarantees a debt, you actually come and take the item from him, and so we would take it from this guarantor's house. V'omer, further we have psukim, and these are psukim also in Mishlei. It says as follows: B'ni, my son, imaravto l'reacho, if you've guaranteed something for your friend, takata lazar kapecha, that you should put out to a stranger your palms. So it's saying that if you've guaranteed something to your friend, you should put out your palms. No kashta b'mreficha, if you've gotten caught or trapped in the words of your mouth, or nokadeta b'mreficha, or you've gotten stuck again in the words of your mouth. And Rashi says, what is that? Shehonesu badvarim, that you were mean to someone, you said something, you made him feel bad, you insulted him, something like that. So we're talking so far about 2 things. We're talking about if you've guaranteed a debt to your friend, or if you've somehow insulted him or hurt him. So the pasuk continues, Asay zos efo b'ni, so then do this, however, or now, my son, v'hinatzel, and you'll be saved. So he says, here's what you should do if you have this issue. If you have either guaranteed a debt, or if you've insulted your friend, kivasa v'chafreecha, that when you come into the palm or the hand of your friend, you should go hisrapes. Hisrapes is kind of like you should weaken yourself or put yourself down. This is the pasuk of Mishlei, but we'll dash in a minute. Urhav reyacha, and you should lift up your friend. That's what the pasuk of Mishlei says. So the way the Gemara is going to understand this is as follows: that he says. We're going to read in Mammon. So we're talking about 2 cases. One is where you guaranteed a debt, and the second is where you insulted him. In Mammon yesh lo biyadecha, if you have money of his in your hand, meaning because since you guaranteed the debt, you now owe him the money. So the pasuk said hisrapes, which would normally mean like put yourself down or weaken yourself. He said the Gemara darshans, it's hater lo pisas yad, that you should release to him the palm of your hand, meaning you should pay him. So this, by the way, is the point of the pasuk, is just to show that if someone guaranteed a debt, you actually have to pay the debt, and that's why you're able to go into his house and take it. But just finishing up the pasuk, v'im lav, and if you're not talking about a case where you owe him money and rather all we're talking about a case is where you've insulted him, then harba olav reim. Then you should, so the way we're saying this is the pasuk says, urhav reyacho, which normally means lift up your friend. We're reading it that harev, that you should increase reyacho, your friends, or your friend. So the idea is if you've insulted him, the halacha is that if you're asking mechila, you come with people. So the idea is if you've insulted him, you ask mechila. So a very long way of just saying psukim that say if you've guaranteed a debt, you should pay it. If you've insulted your friend, you should come with many people and ask him mechila. But what do you see from this? You see that when someone guarantees a debt, it gets collected, and people can therefore go into the house. We learn from the pasuk they could go into the house of the borrower, and they don't have to. They could go into the house of the guarantor, even though they would not be able to go into the home of the borrower himself. The Gemara continues, L'tzad sheni, which Rashi says, Kamod davar acher. It's the same as saying something else, another point. So we're going to make another drasha in these words, L'beiso. So it says, L'beiso iata nechnas. So we learned before from L'beiso that you go into his house, that it's his house you can't go into, but you could go into the house of the guarantor. Now we're going to say a different drasha. L'beiso into his house. L'beiso iata nechnas. You don't go into his house. Al ata nechnas. And so saying for a loan, you would not go into his house and take security. Avalata nichnas l'schar kasef, that if what you're pursuing is not the payment of a loan, but rather you're pursuing a payment for having carried, the schar kasef is the wages of the shoulder, meaning you carried something for him, you were a schlepper. So then, and you want to get paid, that you could go into his house and take a security. L'schar chamor, if he was a donkey driver, you could go in and take your wages. L'schar punduk, if punduk is like an inn or a hotel, so if he stayed by you and he was supposed to pay and he didn't pay, you could go in and take security from his house. L'schar diuknos, if the schar Rashi says diuknos are tsar lo tsuros bebeso beschar, that he was a painter, you brought him into your house to paint decorations on the wall and he didn't pay, so then you could go in his house and take security. So now the Gemara says, Yachol afilu zakvan alav b'milva. So I might think, so we're sitting here and saying, as long as what you're going in to take something from his house is not for a loan, but rather it's for some other wage, then I might think that this halacha is true, even if the following scenario happens. Let's say I'm a painter and I go in his house and I paint the walls, and then I finish painting and I come to him, I say, here, pay me. And he doesn't have the money. And so at some point we said, okay, you know what? I'm afraid you might not pay me, so we're going to convert this to a loan. Let's sign a shtar. I'm lending you the $100 that you were supposed to pay me, so to speak, and in a week from now you'll pay me, or something like that. So if you've taken a debt that was not a loan, a different kind of debt, and debts other than loans, we've just finished saying you can walk into his house and take a security. So, but I might think that if I've switched his debt to me, which was not for a loan, into a loan, that I would still be able to go into his house and take security because the origins of this loan were something other than a loan, but rather wages or something like that. Talmud Lomar, the Talmud Lomar, the pasuk says mashas mu'uma, that the pasuk says kisasha bereacha mashas mu'uma, that when you have by your friend any some kind of loan, and the pasuk, when it says mashas mu'uma means like any loan. So therefore we're saying that no matter what type of loan it is, whether it's a loan that was created because I lent him $100, or whether it was a loan that was created because he owed me money for some other reason and I agreed to take it as a loan, that in any case, as long as it has the character of a loan, I cannot go into his house and take it. If it does not have the character of a loan, meaning if it's wages or something like that, I would be able to go into his house and take a mashkon. Okay, Mishnah. Amana, if you have a widow, ben shehi aniya, ben shehi ashira, whether she is a poor widow or she's a wealthy widow, ein memashkinin osa, we don't go into her house and take security. Shenemar, actually into her house is not necessarily accurate, I'll say in a moment. Ein memashkinin osa, we don't take security from her, shenemar, because it says lo sachbo beged almana, that you should not take security, the beged of an almana. So, and a beged is lav dafka. It's really, you don't take security from an almana. Now, the question is, if the Torah already tells us that you shouldn't go into someone's house and take a mashkon, so what is it telling us here. So, in other words, what's the added halacha by a beged almana? So, one answer is, which we learned in the Gemara, was the idea that it's over on 2 lavim. That if someone goes and takes security from a almana, they're over not only on kisavo, that you're going to go into their house, but rather you're also going to be over on losachbo beged almana. But also another difference is that because there's that extra pasuk, so we say you don't take an item security from a widow, even in the street, and even the shliach bezdin wouldn't go in the street and take an item from her. But basically, you don't take security from a widow. Okay, Tana Rabbanan. The Rabbanan learned the brayso amana ben shehi aniya ben shehi ashira ein memashkin also, that a widow, whether she is poor or she is wealthy, you don't take security from her. Divrei Rabbi Yehuda, these are the words of Rabbi Yehuda. So Rabbi Yehuda is really saying what our Mishnah said. Rabbi Shimon says, no, we make a distinction. Ashira, if she's wealthy, memashkin also, then we would take a security. Aniya, if she's poor, ain't memashkin also. We don't take security from her. So what's the reason why from a rich person, a rich widow will take security and a poor one we won't? Rabbi Shimon says, Shata chayv lahachzer lo, that because you have to every day return this item to her because she's poor. V'ata masia shemra b'shachnusei, that you're going to give her a bad name in her neighborhood, because what's going to happen? You have this widow, she lives by herself, and every morning and every evening this guy comes to her house, and people are going to start to say there's something fishy going on here. So therefore, you don't take security from a poor person. So why is it better by a rich person? Because by a rich person, since presumably she doesn't need the item, you just go take it once. You don't have to come back every day and give it back and pick it up. So one time to show up at the house is not a problem, but to show up twice a day is going to start to create rumors. So that's why Reb Shimon says we distinguish between a poor widow and a wealthy widow. So the Gemara says, "L'meimer is this to say that Rabbi Yehuda lo darish time in the kra, Reb Shimon darish time in the kra." So it seems that what's happening, that Reb Shimon is basically saying, what's the reason the Torah says not to take the beged almana especially, is because it's going to create shemra for her. And so it looks like Reb Shimon darshans the reason of a pasuk. In other words, the question of darshan the reason of a pasuk is, do you look at the reason for a halacha in order to understand when it applies? And Reb Shimon is saying the reason is shemra, so it applies by a poor woman and not by a rich woman. Whereas Reb Yehuda seems to be saying, no, if it says you don't take a beged from an almana, you don't take a beged from an almana, plain. The issue we have with that, if you say that Reb Shimon is darish time in the kra and Reb Yehuda is not, we heard exactly the opposite. We heard that Reb Shimon is not darish time in the kra, Reb Yehuda is darish time in the kra. Where did we see that? The sign, because we learned in a brayso, the Torah in Devarim tells us, v'lo yar b'lo nashim. It's talking about a king. A king should not have too many wives. The pasuk says, v'lo yar b'lo nashim, that he should not have too many, lo yar b'lo nashim, they shouldn't have too many wives. V'lo yasir levavo, and it shouldn't turn his heart. He shouldn't have too much silver or gold. But in any event, it says he shouldn't have too many wives and he shouldn't turn his heart. So that's what the pasuk says. And in the brayso we learn as follows: Rabbi Yehuda says, Mar behu, it's okay. Now, by the way, the Gemara in Sanhedrin tells us that what does it mean to have too many wives? Is 18, more than 18. So up to 18 you can handle. Beyond 18 you shouldn't do. So Rabbi Yehuda says 18 isn't even really a limit. Mar behu, if he wants more wives, he can have more wives. Ubovash shelo Metzia says libo. In other words, he can only handle 18 bad wives who are going to send them off the wrong way. But if they're good wives, then he could have many more. So basically, what's happening? Well, you see that Rabbi Yehuda is darish time at the kra. He's saying the reason that the Torah tells you not to have too many wives is because the wives are going to turn you to the bad path. They're bad wives. But if you have good wives, go, as many as you want. That's Rabbi Yehuda's opinion. So you see, he relies on the reason for the takana. Reb Shimon says, afilu achas v'himesiras libo hareza lo yasena. He says, even one, that is going to turn your heart away, you should not marry her. Right? So im kain matal malomar v'lo yar b'lo nashim. He's saying, so if you're not allowed to have even one wife who's bad, then what does it mean when it says you shouldn't have more than 18? He's saying, because it can't be talking about bad wives. He's saying afilu k'Abigail, even like Abigail was a good wife, And he's saying even good wives, you don't have too many, you don't have more than 18. So what do we see? We see the Reb Yehuda looks at the reason and says you can have more as long as they're not bad for you. And Reb Shimon does not look at the reason and he says, no, you can't, even if they're great wives, you can't have too many of them. So what do we see? We see that Reb Yehuda is darshan time at the Kra, and Reb Shimon does not darsh time at the Kra. So this is the opposite implication of what we were picking up from our brisa that was talking about a rich or poor widow. So the Gemara says, La'olam Reb Yehuda lo darsh time at the Kra. Really what's going on here is Reb Yehuda does not darsh time at the Kra, and so therefore the position that makes sense for him is the one that we had in the case of the Almana, because he said that it doesn't matter whether she's rich or poor, we don't look at the reason. And so if Reb Yehuda does not darsh time at the Kra, then what's the reason by a king that he says the reason is so you shouldn't get turned away? But if they're good wives who aren't going to turn you away, you could have as many as you want. It seems that Reb Yehuda is being darsh time at the Kra. So the Gemara says, V'shani hacha, it's different here. The mefarish Kra, the mefarish Kra, v'lo yarblo susim v'lo yasser. So he says, because the pasuk says the reason. In other words, I don't normally assume a reason for any halacha in the Torah, and therefore I'm not going to paskin on the basis of what I think the reason is. But in this case, the Torah tells it to you. My time lo yarbelo nashim. Why should you not have too many wives? Mishum de lo yasor. So they shouldn't send you off. So Rabbi Yehuda is going to say, ordinarily I am not darish time of the Kra. And that's why, in the case of Almana, a widow, I don't distinguish between whether she's rich or poor. But in the case of a king, I'll distinguish and I'll say, it's the reason you shouldn't have too many is if they're bad wives. But if they're good wives, you can. And he says the reason he'll do that is because in this case the Torah is very explicit about the reason, and in fact, it must be, since the Torah doesn't normally tell us a reason, it's coming to tell us you should darshan the reason. That's how Rabbi Yehuda would understand this particular case. Reb Shimon, so what's the question on Reb Shimon? So we're saying, so fine, if Rabbi Yehuda is the one, so in other words, what do we do with Reb Shimon? Mechti, let's see. Ba'alma darshina in time of the Kra. So he's saying, even though normally, according to Reb Shimon, we would be darish time of the Kra. Where do we see that Reb Shimon is darish time of the Kra? Because in the case of Almana, he distinguishes between a rich and poor one. So if so, why does he not distinguish in the case of a king having too many wives? So he says, Lichtav Rachmana lo yarbe, lo ba'ina lo yasor, v'ano yadana my time lo yarbe mishum de lo yasor. He says, because Reb Shimon says, since I normally am darish time of the Kra, if the pasuk would have just said, you shouldn't have too many, you shouldn't have too many wives. So I would have said, the reason you don't have too many wives is so they don't turn you off. If that's the reason, you can have more wives as long as they don't turn you off. So he's saying, had the Torah said nothing, just said don't have too many wives, I would have been darish time of the Kra, because that's what we do. But in this case, the Torah then proceeded to give a reason. Says, I would know my time of Lo what's the reason you don't have too many wives? So if I would have known it, and I would have made this limud to say you could have more wives as long as they're good, if I would have known it without the pasuk saying the reason, then why did the pasuk say the reason? Normally the pasuk doesn't say a reason. So it must be coming to tell you, that even if you have one bad wife, who's going to turn your heart away, you shouldn't marry her. So he's saying that normally I am darish time of the Kra. In this case I'm not, because the Torah tells us clearly that by adding in lo yasser levavo, so in other words, this is not, lo yasser levavo is no longer explaining the reason you shouldn't have too many wives. It's a separate halacha. It's saying you should not have too many wives. And you should not allow even one wife to turn you off. So if you have one wife to turn you off, it's saying you can't have one wife, then we have to figure out when it says you shouldn't have more than 18 wives, what's it talking about? It must be talking about even wives like Abigail, and that's why in this particular case, Reb Shimon is not darish time of the Kra, because he feels that the psukim preclude what you would have been darish, but ordinarily, for example, in the case of Almana, he would be darish time of the Kra. Okay, Mishnah, HaChovel es Rechayim, over Mishum Losase, So if someone takes security as a rechaim, and rechaim we talked about the other day, is people used to have in their house a small grinder, a mill. They would grind the flour. So that if he goes in and takes that from the borrower over mishum losasei, he is over in a losasei v'chayiv mishum shnei kelim, and he's chayiv for 2 kalim when he takes a mill there's two parts to it. We've talked about this before. There's the Elyona, there's the upper stone, which is called the Rechev, and there's the Tachtona, which is called the Rechayim. Rashi says, Shenamar, because it says, Lo Yachbo Rechayim v'Rechev. That you shouldn't take a Rechayim and Rechev. So the Mishnah is telling you that when you take a complete mill that has an upper stone and a lower stone, you are over on 2 lavim, because it specifies them in the pasuk Rechayim v'Rechev. The Mishnah continues, V'lo Rechayim v'Rechev bilvad amru, and it's not just these stones of a mill, El kol davar she'osim ba'ochel nefesh, anything that is used for his sustenance. So the reason is, when you're taking a security from someone, don't take what he takes for his food. Shenemar, because it says in the pasuk, Ki nefesh hu chovel, because you're taking as security his soul, because you're taking away his sustenance, what he lives off of. Okay. So now the Gemara says, Amr Rav Huna, we're talking about this issue that when you take a mill, you're over on 2 lavim, we said in the Mishnah. So Rav Huna says as follows, Chavel Rechayim, that if someone takes a Rechayim, which is the bottom part of the mill, Lokashtayim, he gets 2 sets of malchus. Mishum Rechayim, one is because it says Losachbo Rechayim, Mishum Ki Nefesh Hu Chovel, and also because it says that it's allowed to take something that he lives off of, right? Because we see that is anything that is ochel nefesh is included in that, and obviously a mill is part of ochel nefesh. So therefore, if he takes just the bottom part, he's over on 2 lavim. Rechayim v'Rechev. What happens if he takes both parts of the mill, the bottom and the top? Loka shalosh. He gets 3 sets of malchus. Why? Mishum Rechayim v'Rechev, because the pasuk says al sachbo Rechayim v'Rechev, so that's 2 different things. So that's 2 lavim. Umishum ki nefesh hu chovel, and also because there's the end part of the pasuk, which says anything that's for ochel nefesh. So therefore, he's over on 3 lavim. So that is the view of Rav Huna. Rav Yehuda says, Chevel Rechayim, if he takes just the bottom part of the mill, Loka Achas, he was over on one lav. V'Rechev Loka Achas, and if he takes the top part of a mill, he also only gets 1 set of malchus. Rechayim v'Rechev, if he takes the bottom and the top, Loka Shtayim, he gets 2. So now the question is, so according to Rabbi Yehuda, you only get Rechayim, Rechev, or both, but you're not getting charged, you're not getting a ding, a lav for Ki Nefesh Hu Chovel, because Rabbi Yehuda understands Ki Nefesh Hu Chovel, that when it says, we're on Amud Beis now, that when it says Ki Nefesh Hu Chovel, that you're taking security, his livelihood or his sustenance, L'shar Dvarim Hu Da'asa. It's coming to tell you other things, because he's saying that if the beginning of the pasuk tells you the halacha by the stones from a mill, right? So it's specific to that. It's telling you that halacha. So therefore, when it comes and tells you kinefesh hu socha, that you're, kinefesh hu chova, that here you're taking his soul, is talking about other things that he uses for sustenance. But you cannot charge him again for kinefesh hu chova for something that was already referenced in the beginning, the millstones. So we have a machlokes Rav Huna and Rav Yehuda. So the Gemara says, Lema Bava Rava v'plukta the Rav Huna Rav Yehuda kamiflagi. So Rav Huna and Rav Yehuda argue about this, and it looks to us like Abaye and Rava argue later about something very similar. Why? What's the machlokus by Abaye and Rava? The Amar Rava. Rava says this is talking about the Karban Pesach. So the Karban Pesach, we know that says Al tochlu mimenu na uvasha mavushal b'mayim, that you should not eat the Karban Pesach when it is na, means partially cooked. Uvasha mavushal b'mayim, nor can you boil it or cook it. Ki im tzli eish, but rather you should only eat it as it roasted over fire. That's the pasuk. So now we're going to analyze this. Amar Rava. Rava says, Achol na, if he goes ahead and he eats the Karban Pesach partially roasted, lokesh shtayim, he gets 2 sets of malchus. Why? Mishum na, because first of all, the Torah says don't eat it partially cooked, and he ate it partially cooked. And secondly, Mishum ki im tzli eish, that it says you should only eat it roasted, and therefore you're over on a second lav, because you ate it not roasted, you ate it partially roasted. And the Gemara Rava continues, Mavushal, let's say he cooks the Karban Pesach, he boils it up,
we say lo kashtayim. He also gets 2 sets of malchus. Why? Mishum mavoshol, because the Torah says not to cook it, and he cooked it. Mishum kiyim tzliesh, because it says you can only do it roasted, and he cooked it instead, so he's over on 2. What happens if this guy just loves getting averos and messing things up? So he went, no, mavushal. So he took his carbon pesach, he cut it in half, he partially roasted one half, and he cooked the other half. And then he ate them. So we say, Loka Shalosh, she gets 3 sets of malchus. Why? Mishum na, because the Torah says not to eat it partially roasted, and he ate part of it partially roasted. Umishum mavushal, the Torah says not to cook it, and he ate part of it cooked. Umishum lo sochlenu, Kiyim tzliesh, and it says that you shouldn't that you shouldn't eat it except if it's roasted over fire. So therefore, he's over on 3 lavim. So what do you see? You see that Rava, much like we had in the case of Reb Huna, he counts what's listed in the beginning for a lav, and then the one at the end that kind of is the catch-all, he counts that too. So he gets 3 lavim, just like Rav Huna did Rechaim, Rechev, and Ki Nefesh Uchovel. So he's doing Na, Mavoshol, and Kiyim Tzliesh. Okay, so that seems to be, Rava seems to be saying something just like what Rav Huna said. Abaya says, Ein Loken Alav Shabachlolos. Abaya says, sorry. If he eats it Na, if he eats it partially raw, partially roasted, then he's over on that. If he eats it cooked, he's over on that. So in each case, 1 lav. If he eats it, half of it partially roasted and half of it cooked, so he's over on 2 lavim, but it can't be over on 3 lavim, because the end part of the pasuk that says ki im tzliesh is just a general category, and you're not over on a lav for general categories. So the Gemara says, Lema Bayad Amak Rav Yehuda. So Bayad is like Rav Yehuda, just like Rav Yehuda didn't want to be Doresh Ki Nefesh Hu Chovel to be its own independent lav. So too Abaya did not want to be Doresh Kim Tzliesh to be an independent lav, because it's lav Shebechlolos. But Rava, the Amak Rav Huna, and Rava says like Rav Huna, because Rava is the one who says that you're over on Na and Mavoshel and Kiyim Tzliesh, and similarly Rav Huna is the one who said you're over on Rechaim, you're over on Chevel, and you're over on Ki Nefesh Uchovel. So that the Gemara is trying to say that those machlokesim are parallel. Rava says, and so we're going to say that both Rava and Abaya will tell you we're not necessarily in agreement on these things. Rava would tell you, I'm not just like Rav Shimon. When I say that you can be I can be even consistent with Rabbi Yehuda. Why? Because Ad Kan Lo Kam Rabbi Yehuda Hasam. Because when Rabbi Yehuda said over there that in the case of Rechaim and Rechev, that he said you can only be over on Rechaim and or Rechev, but not ki nefesh uchovel, ela the ki nefesh uchovel lo mashma Rechaim v'Rechev. That and the way Rashi explains this is that nefesh that when it says Rechaim v'Rechev, if it just said Rechaim v'Rechev, what would I know? I would know that you can't do an upper stone and you can't do a lower stone, but I wouldn't know anything else. So he's saying, since ki nefesh uchovel is not implied if it would simply say Rechaim v'Rechev, so it's a little bit funny way of reading it, but that's how we read it. Hilkach l'shrar dvarim hu da'asa. So in other words, it's coming to tell you something new, because if it only said Rechaim v'Rechev, I would not know that anything that is his livelihood. So therefore, when it comes to tell me something new, that it's coming to tell me other things. Right? So it's not coming to tell me Rechaim v'Rechev, it's coming to say anything, because that's, remember, we said it's l'shar dvarim hudas, it comes to other things. So therefore, since it says Rechaim v'Rechev, and from Rechaim v'Rechev, I would not know anything that's nefesh, so therefore, when it comes to say nefesh, it's coming to tell me anything other than Rechaim v'Rechev. Avol hacha, but here, in the case of the carbon pesach, ki im tzliesh l'mayasa. So he says tzliesh, it's not adding something new. I would know it already, because why? The way Rashi learns is because you have 3 ways you can eat meat of the carbon pesach. You can cook it, you can partially roast it, or you can fully roast it, right? So if I told you cannot cook it and you can't partially roast it, then I obviously know that you can't fully cook it, right? So I would know the klal from the 2 things. Unlike Rechaim v'Rechev. If you tell me an upper stone and a lower stone, I don't know anything that's nefesh. But if you tell me not partially roasted and not cooked, I know that you can only eat it fully roasted. So when the Torah comes along and tells that to me anyway, Shema Minol Alav. It's coming to tell you an extra lav. So that's why Rava is going to say that, I'm not, Rabbi Yehuda wouldn't necessarily argue with me here. We're saying something different because the structure of the psukim is different. Rabbi Amar Lecha, and Abaye would say to you, Ano, the Amri Afilu Rav Huna. I can say my halacha is not inconsistent with Rav Huna, because Ad Kan Lakam Rav Huna Hasam Ela Dechi Nefesh Chovel Yiserahu. So he says that when Rav Huna said, in the case of Rechaim v'Rechev, that you could be over on 3 lavim, for Rechaim, for Rechev, and Ki Nefesh Chovel, that's because the words Ki Nefesh Chovel are added, because we don't need it. So therefore, given the Yiserahu, since it's extra, and it's coming to tell us anything that is Nefesh, Shadya Rechaim v'Rechev. So you can throw it on top of Rechaim v'Rechev, meaning that Rechaim v'Rechev fit in that category of something that is Nefesh. So therefore, because Nefesh is extra, that if you do Rechaim and Rechev, you're not only over on Rechaim and Rechev, you're also over on Nefesh. Aval Hacha, but here, in the case of Karban Pesach, Ki'im Tzli Eish, which is the kind of catch-all at the end, which Rav Huna, in the other case, charged you for, here, he would not charge you. Why? Because Ki'im Tzli Eish, Lav Yiserahu. Because according to him, he says that the pasuk, unlike Ki Nefesh Uchova, which is extra, Ki'im Tzli Eish is not extra. Why? Now we said it's extra because, you only have 3 choices, and if we ruled out 2, you're obviously only left with the 3rd. He says, no, because I need that pasuk Ki'im Tzli Eish in accordance with the following brisa. The Mevayilei L'Chadisanya, we need it according to this that we learned in the brisa. B'shah sheyashnu b'kum achal tzli, yashnu b'val tochel, yashnu b'val tochel na. So he's saying as follows: at the time that someone is in the category of being commanded to eat the Karban Pesach fully roasted, when is that? That's the night of Pesach. Yashnu b'val tochel na. That's the time at which he is in the category of being prohibited from eating it partially roasted. So therefore, b'shah she'ena b'kum achal tzli, at a time when he is not in the category of being told to eat it fully roasted, like for example, on Erev Pesach or the next day or a week later, right? He might be over on other things, but the point is, Eina b'val tochel na. So he says, but if, so he says, the words Ki'im Tzli Eish are not extra. Because what do I need it for? I need it to tell me when am I over on eating it partially roasted or cooked, if I eat it during the time that I'm otherwise obligated to eat the Karban Pesach fully roasted, which is the night of Pesach. So if, for example, I were to eat the Karban Pesach, I'm really hungry on Erev Pesach, and I eat the Karban Pesach partially roasted or cooked, I would not be over on the Isser, because the Isser Lav only applies during the time that you're obligated to eat it Ki'im Tzli Eish. So therefore, those words are not extra. If they're not extra, I can't add them to the list of lavin that the person would be over on. And therefore, he says, if I eat it partially roasted and cooked, I'm only going to be over on those 2 lavin, but not the 3rd, because the 3rd is not extra. It's coming to teach me something else.